Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of Debunking Missionary Claims with Rabbi Moshe Shulman. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you, Rabbi, for showing up. He's like, Rabbi always shows up. That's okay. It's good to have you, as always.
Sometimes I'm
Right, that's funny. So just for humor's sake, guys, I was like, you know what, you can go tonight. We were talking. I said, we're starting late. He says, and I'm like, yeah, but you can go as long as you need to. We can whatever. And then I really suspected him to say, we go on 3 or 4 hours, and I was like, no, we're still cutting you off at an hour because I got to go to bed soon. So anyway, but it's good to have you back, Rabbi. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay, thank you.
And I really do enjoy this series, and I know a lot of people do as well. And so, and for the people viewing, it's very important that if you like the video, please click the like button and also share it on YouTube. Share it via text messages with your friend, with your aunt, uncle, grandpa, neighbor's dog, whatever. So, we're going to move on and let Rabbi do his thing. So once again, thank you for tuning in. And if you have any questions, please do me a favor. In the text of in the chat of YouTube, just put a little @ symbol and Tanakh Talk, because then I can scroll through fast and find out if there's actually a question there. If you don't, we'll miss your question. So make sure you put the @ symbol and Tanakh Talk, no spaces on any of it, and then I'll be able to see it pretty quickly. So, Rabbi, go ahead and take this thing away, and we'll see what you got. Okay.
Okay, fine. This will be the third talk we're going to have about the historical Jesus, and we're going to cover Josephus today. For that one paragraph and one line in all of Josephus, it's going to take us probably about an hour, maybe a few minutes longer, but I want to at least finish it this week.
Okay.
I just want to do a quick review from what we had last week. Remember, we're dealing with the question of what kind of evidence do we have about Jesus? Christians make the claim that his life is the most documented life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what we did is last week we just went through the closest sources to the time of Jesus that are non-Christian that tell us something about him. And we didn't have very much. Suetonius, who was about the 110s, which is quite a bit longer after that. There were already Christian books written that were being circulated. Mentions Jesus twice, or mentions Christians twice. We have to make a distinction here between mentions of Christians as a group, as opposed to mentioning about Jesus himself, information about him as a person, which is a different story. Now, Suetonius mentions two instances. One is in the year 49 of the Common Era, under the Emperor Claudius, and the mention was that there was some kind of disruption in Rome, where the Jews were expelled from the city of Rome. They were expelled for a few years, I guess, because of the fights that came over Crestus. Some people have assumed that that's talking about Jesus. Doesn't tell very much, except that he might have existed. And there are some doubts that it might not actually be Jesus at all, might be somebody else, uncertain. But let's assume that it is. So we know that by 49, Jesus was known, not new information. Again, when I told you in the beginning, I told you that I accepted Jesus existed and that he had followers and stuff like that. So it's not so unusual. The second thing Suetonius mentions is also mentioned in Tacitus. Suetonius mentions in the year 64, Nero, when there was a fire in Rome, he blamed it on the Christians. Tacitus, who's writing about approximately the same time, mentions Pilate, and if you read what he says there, he clearly does not see it as a Jewish religion related to Jewish religion. I'm going to come back to that later, not in the next session, but one of the sessions, the significance of that. So he does not mention it, and the only thing we can tell is we're not quite sure where he got it. It doesn't seem to be coming from any kind of actual records. So what we have from there is that basically there was a person named Jesus who was killed, crucified by Pontius Pilate in the time of Tiberius Caesar. And that's that as far as historical stuff. The next piece of information we have is more about Christians than about Jesus as a person. So far we know nothing except basically the fact that I think most people agree to. Jesus probably existed and was probably executed at the time of Pilate, but not much information besides that outside of the New Testament. The next one we have is from Pliny the Younger, who was a governor in Bithynia, where there were Christians all over the place there, apparently. And we read where he wrote to Trajan, who was the emperor at the time, asking what to do. One of the things we see clearly is that these people were not Jewish because they did not appeal to the Roman law, which allowed Jews to not worship the emperor. And so since they were a new religion, not associated with Judaism, they were required to worship the emperor. As I mentioned, the Roman gods were like the mafia, so they were required to contribute to the extortion money they had to pay to the mafia. Essentially what Trajan said is that you should not search them out, you should not accept anonymous people saying that somebody's a Christian. But we do see there who were apparently Gentiles were already performing acts of worship to Jesus as a god. So that we're talking about is the early 1st century, so it probably started sometime in the late 1st century. After that, we really get nothing that tells us very much information. Lucian Samosata, sometime in the late 2nd century, he wrote some satires, and he basically wrote things making fun of Christians. Celsus, which we're going to see a little bit later, some things from him. He brings mainly scurrilous things that were known about Jesus, or talked about Jesus, also in the late 2nd century. Besides that, there are two other sources that we mentioned here. One is Thales, who was quoted in Africanus in the 3rd century, talking about some kind of an eclipse, and the claim was that it refers to the eclipse of the crucifixion, but we have no idea who this Thales was, when he lived, or if he had any relationship. The last one was someone Martyr Serapion, who referred to Jesus as a philosopher of the Jews, and that's basically it. So we don't really have any kind of information. We don't know anything about a virgin birth. We don't know anything about his miracles and stuff like that, really. We don't know anything about his Passion Week, crucifixion, all the main things that we have. We don't know anything about the early followers or anything like that. So that's the information that we have from outside. A few sources, most of them, they basically are in the 2nd century and don't tell us anything more than what basically anybody who had heard from had asked the Christians themselves, as Pliny himself mentioned. He asked Christians what their religion was about. So it's nothing more than what you can get second-hand or third-hand or fourth-hand or fifth-hand information. Doesn't tell us very much. Okay, so now we want to go into what is considered by many one of the most important so-called proofs of the existence of Jesus, and that is a passage in the work of Jesus in Josephus. It's called, technically called a Testimonium Flavianum. Josephus' name was Flavius Josephus. The reason is because he, after the war in 70, he was adopted by Vespasian, and Vespasian's name was Flavius, dynasty, Flavian dynasty. So he took the name Flavius in honor of his protectors. So this is called Testimonium Flavium because Flavius Josephus was his name. Now, before we go into the actual text itself, there's actually two texts. One text about Jesus himself, one text referring to James, who's referred to as the brother of Jesus. Now, let's examine the situation here a second. One of the main problems is this. Josephus was a book which was under the control of the church. Now we saw, as far as the New Testament was concerned, that in fact the church had no problem falsifying and adding stories and stuff like that. Remember the long mark, the story of the adulterous woman who gets added to the New Testament and now appears in ours. So the Christians themselves had no problem with this, what we now consider sacred scripture, to add things. So it really means that we have to consider, is this original part of the original? Now, in all truth, what we have is basically three views. There are views that say that it's totally bogus. There are views that say it's totally totally true that Josephus wrote that. That's a very, very small amount of people do it. The majority of scholars, both Christian and otherwise, believe in a shortened version of some sort of the Josephus passage. Now, to understand why they will accept at least a shortened passage and why there are people who deny it, we have to recognize that there were a lot of interaction between Jews and Christians. There was a lot of apologetic work going on. So passages in Josephus would clearly be of quite a bit of importance. However, what we find is that the first place where we find this actual passage citing Josephus is Acts in Eusebius, which is the 4th century. Before that, we don't really have anybody who quotes it. Now, what makes this interesting and important is there's 2 works where we would have thought that if this passage was actually legitimate, it would have appeared there. Okay? Now, the first one, which is earlier, is a work by Justin Martyr. Martyr wasn't his last name. He was a martyr. He was killed for his faith. So his name was Justin, and he was called Martyr. So the name comes down just to Martyr. He wrote a number of apologetical works. One of his was actually probably the first work written from a Christian as an apologetic to Judaism. It's called The Dialogue with Tropho. Tropho was a Jew who apparently Justin has created a dialogue. Now, Justin had been a philosopher, so many people think that this actual dialogue is based on Plato's dialogue, type of dialogues, where 2 people talk together. There's a lot of serious doubts about whether Tropho was actually a real person. There's some reasons why I think it wasn't, but that would be an issue for another day. It doesn't really matter as far as this story is concerned. What does concern us is that, in fact, there are a few passages that exist in Justin Martyr, in Dialogues with Tropho, which would have been perfect ones to have Justin use from Josephus to prove his point to another Jewish person, because after all, Josephus was a Jew. Now, the first one we find here is in chapter 8. And this is what he says in chapter 8. We have Tropho discussing with Justin, and exhibits a little bit of doubt as to that Jesus exists. As he says, I approve of your other remarks and admire the eagerness with which you study divine things. But it were better for you still to abide in the philosophy of Plato, or of some other man, cultivating endurance, self-control, and moderation, rather than be deceived by false words and follow the opinions of men of no reputation. For if you remain in the mode of philosophy and live blamelessly, a hope of a better destiny will be left to you. But when you have forsaken God and reposed confidence in man, what safety still awaits you? If then you are willing to listen to me, for I have already considered you a friend, first be circumcised, then observe what ordinances have been enacted with respect to the Sabbath and the feast and the new moons of God, and in a word do all things which have been written in the law, and then perhaps you shall obtain mercy from God. But Christ, if he has indeed been born, exists anywhere is unknown, and does not even know himself, and has no power until Elias, meaning Elijah the prophet, come to anoint him and make it manifest to all. And you, having accepted a groundless report, invent a Christ for yourself, and for his sake are inconsiderately perishing. Now, at this point, the natural answer would be telling to a Jew that he didn't. A Jew telling you he didn't exist. He said, "Well, what about Josephus? He was a Jew. Look what he says about Jesus. He knew about Jesus existing, but he doesn't mention it." The next discussion he brings is that he says, "I'm sorry, we actually do believe in what our beliefs are not baseless and false." There are 2 other passages here which we might have thought Josephus might be mentioned. In the middle of chapter 69, the first one was in chapter 8, by the way, if you're writing down, if you want to look it on your own. The next one is in chapter 69, excuse me. Now, here it talks about Jesus and the kinds of miracles he did. The spirit of living water which gushed forth from God in the land destitute of the knowledge of God, namely the land of the Gentiles, was this Christ, who also appeared in your nation and healed those who were maimed and deaf and lame in body from their birth, causing them to leap, to hear, and to see by his word. And having raised the dead and causing them to live, by his deeds he compelled the men who lived at the time to recognize him. But though they saw such works, they asserted it was magical art, for they dared to call him a magician and a deceiver of the people. Again, how could he say this when we read the passage which appears in Josephus, it actually refers to him as somebody who does wonders, godly things, so it doesn't make sense. It appears that he didn't know of that passage. And the last passage is in chapter 108. In 108 it says, "You have sent chosen, ordained men throughout all the world to proclaim that a godless," this is Trefach saying, "that a godless and lawless heresy had sprung from the one Jesus, a Galilean deceiver, whom we crucified and by his disciples stole him by night from the tomb, where he was laid when unfastened from the cross. And now deceive men by asserting that he has risen from the dead and ascended to heaven. Moreover, you accuse him of having taught those godless, lawless, and unholy doctrines which he mentioned to the condemnation of those who confess him to be Christ, and a teacher from and Son of God. Besides this, even when your city is captured and your land ravaged, you do not repent, but dare to utter imprecations on him and all who believe in him. Yet we do not hate you or those who by your means have conceived such prejudice against us, but we pray that even now all of you may repent and obtain mercy from God, the compassionate, long-suffering Father of all." Again, this appears to me to show that he is not aware of that passage from Josephus. Now, let me read that passage. I probably should have read it before we started, but listening to the kinds of things you heard just and right, it seems to me that he never saw this passage. William, I sent you a number of Word files. This one is titled Book 18, Chapter 3, Paragraph 3.
Okay, let me
That's
look.
Yours?
Let me look for it. I actually wasn't prepared to pull up tonight, but I can find it.
Well, I should have told you beforehand.
Yeah, that's
that way
good.
it makes it easier. I can read it, but they can see it also in front of themselves.
Go ahead and read it, but tell me what the main head title would be.
The top of the page says Book 18, Chapter 3, Paragraph 3.
Okay, Book 18, Chapter 3. Okay. Go ahead and start talking. I'll see if I can load it quickly enough.
Okay, and it says printed versions.
Okay.
So let me read it. "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man. For he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these, and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named for him, are not extinct at this day." Now, again, it would be pretty difficult to understand if this was actually available and was true, how Justin could not have had in his pocket say, "Listen, Josephus says such and such and such and such. How can you accept this?" Okay, that's one of the proofs of it. The second one is going to be from Origen. Origen was in the 3rd century, early 3rd century. Okay, what Origen writes is even much stronger of a proof that it's false, that it never appeared at the time. These quotes, there are 2 quotes here that are from the first book, called the first book, and this is chapter 47. What makes us know that he doesn't know about Jesus is because of what's said in this particular one, where he says this: "I would like to say to Celsus, who represents the Jew as accepting somehow John as a Baptist, who baptized Jesus, that the existence of John the Baptist baptizing for the remission of sins is related by one who lived no great length of time after John and Jesus. Excuse me. It appears that Celsus in his original work doubted both Jesus and John. But here, Origen, in the Contra Celsus, he's saying that, 1 second, you can't say that. Why? For the 18th book of his Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus bears witness to John as having been a Baptist and as promising purification to those who underwent the ritual. So here we see that Origen is quite familiar with Josephus. But then he continues, which is now the problem. Now this writer, although not believing in Jesus as the Christ, and seeking after the cause of the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, whereas he ought to have said that the conspiracy against Jesus were the cause of these calamities befalling the people, since they put to death Jesus, the Christ, who was a prophet, that says nevertheless, being, although against his will, not far from the truth, that these disasters happened to the Jews as a punishment for the death of James the Just, who was a brother of Jesus, called Christ. The Jews having put him to death, although he was a man most distinguished for his justice. Now, that second passage is referring to the James passage that appears in Josephus, which refers to the death of James, the brother of Jesus, called the Messiah. That's what it says there. There are reasons to doubt that that's true also, but this is the first time that's mentioned. But Origen mentions that, but Trypho doesn't mention either of them. I mean, the Trypho appears not to have been aware of it at all, either passage. Okay, so that's the first one. Here we see a clear indication that were it the case that Josephus didn't mention about Jesus in that passage, this is the perfect place to do it. And not only that, but he says that Josephus did not believe that Jesus was the Christ, whereas if we read the Josephus passage that's here, it says he was the Christ. So apparently that was a passage unknown to him. And this is known to scholars, and by Christian scholars we're going to see also agree with this. Okay? And then again, in chapter 68, he brings a second thing here, where he again talks about Jesus and talks about his miracles, and pretty much like what we see in Justin, he talks about Jesus being called a magician. But after this is chapter 68 in the first book. But after this, Celsus, having suspicion that the great works performed by Jesus, of which we have named a few out of a great number, would be brought forth to view, affects to grant that those statements may be true, which are made regarding his cures or his resurrection and feeding the multitude with a few loaves, from which many fragments remained over, or those other stories which Celsus thinks the disciples have recorded as of a marvelous nature. And he adds, well, let us believe that these were actually wrought by you. And then he immediately compares them to the tricks of jugglers who profess to do more wonderful things, and to feats performed by those who have been taught by Egyptians. Interesting mention of Egyptians, since the New Testament claims he went to Egypt, who in the middle of the marketplace in return for a few obols will impart the knowledge of the most venerated arts, and will expel demons from men, and dispel diseases, and evoke the souls of heroes, and exhibit expensive banquets and tables and dishes and dainties having no real existence. And will put in motion, as if alive, what are not really living animals, but which have only the appearance of life. So again, he goes on here pretty much like that, discussing how Celsus believed that Jesus was a magician, not a holy person, but a magician. And again, we don't see anywhere where he makes an appeal to Josephus himself, who again, it says here, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as we do with pleasure. Apparently, the positive message of the passage of Josephus would contraindicate that he was somebody like that. Okay, so now let's look at the versions that exist. I just read to you Whiston's version, the Whiston version. That does appear in is quoted in, this is F.F. Bruce. And I also have another book by Darrell Bach, because we use both of them, because both of them do have critical comments to make. Now, in addition to this, I read to you before, and let me read it again. This is the version that we have from Whiston, and I'm going to read to you two other versions that we have to give you an idea that it's not so simple a situation. So let's go to the early version. And William, if you want to put that up again, I'll read it again.
Okay, I actually cannot find the source. I'm going to have to let you just read off on it.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's a shame, because it's a little bit, what we're going to do now is going to be a little bit more difficult. Okay. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man. For he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again on the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these, and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians so named for him are not extinct at this day. So this is a very, very positive statement about Jesus. Now we have actually two other versions of this. One by Shlomo Pines, who found an Arabic version of it. Now his version is quite simple. Unfortunately you can't find it, I guess, the files I sent you, because I actually crossed out from the original and made in bold characters the what's added. So for example, in the Arabic, let me just read you what was taken out, and then I'll read you the whole text. Where it starts, there was about at this time, it takes now there was about, where it says, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. That's been taken out. He was the Christ was taken out from the Arabic. And when Pilate is left here, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, so Pilate is the only one who seems to have been killed him. Those that loved him at first did not forsake him. Again, the third day, and he was alive. He was alive. Again, the third day, divine prophets foretold. Let me just read what it ends up being now, because it's a little bit, since these crossouts are going to be difficult to see. So let's see what it ends up now. At this time, there was a man called Jesus, and many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to the cross, and he died. And those that had been his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was thought to be the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have related wonders, and the people of Christians, named after him, has not disappeared till this day. So we see a number of significant differences in the Arabic version. Rather than saying that he was a Christ specifically, for example, they don't say it. He's not referred to as a wise man, just a certain man. Doesn't seem to be much about miracles and stuff like that. His resurrection does still appear there, but that's basically it. It's much more simpler and much less information. Now there's another one, and this is from the Ethiopian version of Josephus. Now, while the version that we see from the Arabic might lend someone to think that, well, it's slightly different, maybe it's possible that, some errors in the versions were written correctly. Maybe you can get from one version to another by some scribal errors and stuff like that. But we have the Ethiopian version, which it appears in the Ethiopian Josephus. And Ethiopian is like a Semitic language. And this is quite long. But when you read it, you will see that obviously Josephus was being used in order to push some beliefs. At that time, there appeared a certain man, if it is proper to call him a man, For his nature and form were human, but his appearance was superhuman, and his works were divine. It is therefore impossible for me to call him a mere man. But on the other hand, if I consider that his nature was shared by others, I will not call him an angel. Everything that he performed, through an invisible power he wrought by word and command. Some said, our first lawgiver is risen from the dead, and he has displayed signs and wonders. But others thought that he was sent from God. In many respects, however, he opposed the law, and he did not keep the Sabbath according to the custom of our forefathers. Now, obviously, there's many reasons to believe this is not true. Yet, he did nothing shameful. He did nothing with his hands, but with his bare word alone. Many of the common people followed him and paid heed to his teachings, and many men's minds were stirred, for they thought that through him the Jewish tribes could free themselves from the power of Rome. It was his custom to stay outside the city on the Mount of Olives. There he wrought cures for the people. 150 assistants joined him, and a multitude of the populace. When they saw his power and his ability to accomplish by a word whatever he desired, they communicated to him the will that he should enter the city, cut down the Roman troops, and pilot and reign over them. But he would not listen to them. When news of this was brought to the Jewish leaders, they assembled along with the high priest and said, we are too powerless and weak to resist the Romans. But since the bow is bent, we will go and tell Pilate what we have heard. And then we shall avoid trouble. For if he hears of it from others, we shall be robbed of our goods, and we shall be slaughtered, and our children dispersed. So they went and told Pontius Pilate. So they went and told Pilate. Pilate sent soldiers who killed many of the multitude. The miracle worker was brought before him, and after he held an inquiry concerning him, he pronounced judgment as follows. He is a benefactor. He is no criminal, no rebel, no seeker after kingship. So we released him, for he had healed his wife when she was dying. He went back to his usual place and did his customary work. Even more people gathered around him, and he gained even more glory by his acts. The scribes were stung with envy, and they gave Pilate 30 talents to kill him. He took it and gave them liberty to carry out the will. So they seized him and crucified him, contrary to the law of their fathers. Now, there's lots of indications as to why this has got to be in the 2nd century, the 2nd century or later. But for our purpose here, it's quite clear that, number one, that's totally bogus. Number two, it's clear that Christians were, in fact, doctoring the Josephus text. And that there's a lot of reasons to doubt its validity. Now, this being known, there have been many attempts of seeing what can be done to just make it look better. So the first one that I want to read back to you is based by Klausner and Meyer. These are two secular scholars. And what they have done is they have eliminated from here certain things that they see in this that are most likely not from Josephus. So, for example, the phrase that says, if it be lawful to call him a man, is clearly something that a Christian would say and not Josephus. He was the Christ is another one they pull out. And then, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold that these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. That they also pull out. So with Klausner and Meyer, we end up having this as what it should be. Now there was at this time Jesus a wise man, for he was a doer of startling deeds and a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. And he gained a following both among many Jews and many of Greek origin. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal man among us, condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, and the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct to this day. So it's a little bit weaker, neutral, but it still maintains its positive view. Now, interestingly enough, F.F. Bruce himself brings what he calls a negative version. What that means is this version in which certain things were added to it in order to make it sound more like somebody who was a non-Christian Jew having negative views of Christianity might have said at that time. So let me read what he says. He adds actually a few things. He takes out some things, he adds a few things. And this is what he comes out with at the end. And this is from F.F. Bruce, by the way, basing it on the possibilities of what may have been taken out and what may have been added. So he takes out a number of things, and he adds it up, and it ends up like this. This is, by the way, on page 39, I believe, here, in F.F. Bruce's book, yes. This is on 39, page 39 of F.F. Bruce, Jesus and Christian Origins Outside the New Testament. Okay, so this is what he has. Now there was about this time a source of further trouble in one Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, who was doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as gladly welcomed strange things. He led away many Jews and also many of the Gentiles. He was a so-called Christ. When Pilate, acting on information supplied by the principal men among us, condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not cease to cause trouble, and the tribe of Christians so named for him are not extinct at this day. So he adds a few things. He still has some things in here that are somewhat doubtful, Christ and such things like that. But seeing his way of going, you sort of get an idea of where we might be going on this. I mean, remember,
right.
If somebody's doctoring a text, it means they're not doctoring necessarily just negative stuff, things that are positive, adding positive stuff. They're probably taking out negative things at the same time. And that's really the logic behind that. William, you were going to ask me something?
No. I thought you were I thought you were addressing me on something. You're good.
No. Okay. In the spirit of Bruce, what I did is actually I analyzed it. Now I took into consideration, we know from in the 2nd century from Celsus and from other sources, many of the things that were said about Jesus at that time. And I just remember, Josephus wrote at the end of the 1st century. So it's even possible that some of these things that were said about Jesus were in fact known by that time and may have been included. So what I've done is I've actually taken out some things and added things that would basically certainly please Celsus and would probably be along with what he would have felt in the 2nd century. Tréfoe also indicates many things about the scurrilous nature of Jesus. So here's my final construction. It's slightly different, but this is the final construction that I came up with. And of course, you're allowed to do things. All these things, by the way, were known by the 2nd century. Sometime in the 2nd century, we have sources which actually mention people referring to Jesus in this way, like Celsus. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man in his own eyes, who was a bastard, whose father was a Roman guard who had made his mother pregnant. That, in fact, was a claim going around in the early 2nd century. For he was doer of startling deeds through incantations and magic, and other forbidden arts. That appears in both Tréfoe and Celsus. A teacher of such foolish men as has not received the truth with pleasure. Celsus sort of indicates that also. And he gained a following both among many ignorant Jews and many of Greek origin. And when Pilate condemned him to the cross for his dangerous and false messianic pretensions, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him. And the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct at this day and continue to be a plague to Jews and Romans. Now the purpose of that is this. We know that it's being doctored. We have no clue what it is. But even if we are going to say that maybe Josephus wrote something, we don't know what he wrote. And in fact, I think most likely my reconstruction represents the most negative stuff known at the end of the 1st century, and it's as likely or as possible as any of the other ones. So now there is another passage referring to James. Let me read it here. I just had it here a second. I just lost it. Yeah, F.F. Bruce brings it here on page 36. This is talking about that when there was a person named Ananias who, when there was like no high priest at the time, he like seized power. And says he convened a judicial session of the Sanhedrin and brought before it the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ, James by name, and some others whom he charged with breaking the law and handed over to be stoned to death. Now that's a Josephus. The word, the so-called Christ, is really the question. Was that there or wasn't it there? Either way, not sure. If Josephus had referred to Jesus as the Christ earlier, or if there was that passage, there's a possibility it could be done. And if it didn't, it didn't. We do, of course, as I mentioned, we did see the James passage mentioned later on in Origen, which is, of course, in the third century, excuse me, meaning that in that time, Celsus wrote in the 2nd century sometime. So we know that late 2nd, 3rd century, the idea of James being the brother of Jesus and something like that being in Josephus is a possibility. But we really can't say whether it was there true or not. More people think the James passage is true. Again, once you see the kind of information, once you see the kind of tampering that was going on, and the fact that we don't know, in my mind, it seems to be something that you should, we can't really rely upon. So let me conclude now on this. I guess I went a little bit faster. I hope it wasn't because I was talking fast. What do we know from this? Number one is most likely that passage itself is bogus. Those things that are left over when you remove it, when you find any of the text where you remove the information and you read it, any of those things can be written by Christians anyways. So that if a Christian was going to add something, he could add a smaller amount rather than a larger. We see that, in fact, there's an Arabic version which has certainly less. The version that we have here is more, and there's an Ethiopian version which has a lot. So we see tampering is definitely going on. So it would seem to me that since Christians could have written those, saying, well, what would a Jew write about it? And then started with that, and if anything, been embellished. So my feeling is that most likely it's not. Again, there are some scholars who believe that it was. But even if we say that it was, what does it tell us about Jesus? Josephus wrote at the end of the 1st century. By that time, there were Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians around there. Nobody has any question about that. The information he got would have been from them. And so it essentially tells us very little or nothing. We're left with something that most scholars, I agree with this also, that yes, there existed someone named Jesus. Yes, he was crucified by Pilate. He was probably some kind of a teacher. He was probably believed to have been the Messiah. But besides that, nothing else really of any value. Okay. What I want to do is next week, I'm going to go into the Talmud.
Okay.
There are a number of passages about Jesus in the Talmud which are discussed. So I would like to, next week, go into them. Okay?
Fair enough.
And,
yeah, for sure.
Okay. I'd rather break now and start that. Then after that, we're going to go some conclusionary stuff. And also, I want to discuss, as part of the historical Jesus, I want to give a theory of mine that came up. Again, it's a theory,
Okay.
but I think there's documented information. We know that there was at time, first we know there's a split between the Jewish Christians and Judaism, which is pretty much documented to have been by the Bar Kokhba revolt.
Okay.
But the question is, when did an actual split between Jewish and Gentile Christianity occur? So I want to look into that question. I've mentioned my theory to a few people, and it seems to be intriguing. I'm not going to guarantee it's true, but it's something we might want to look at. So I think I'll leave it right here. If there are any questions about the historical Jesus, if somebody wants to ask or something like that, certainly is the time to do it.
I don't
Now,
see
what 9 Jewish sources have.
I'm scanning the questions right now. There aren't any questions what I can see right now. So I don't know. There may be there, but just for the viewers out there, make sure that you understand that if you want to put a question on the live stream in the comments section, forgive my voice. I've been sick this past week. Thankfully, you can't catch a cold or anything contagious through the internet. So otherwise, you'd all be sick right now. So I'm watching the chat, the open live chat. And if you want to have a question, in fact, you can do it now if you want. Just simply type in the @ symbol with no spaces, @Tanakh Talk, and then put your question there. And I see a couple of Tanakh Talk flags, but none of them are questions. So, and I'm not going to read through all the other comments to find one. So I need to have them tagged or flagged. But Rabbi, I don't see any questions as it stands at the moment.
Maybe you have a question. Maybe you want to ask something.
I spend a lot of time watching the chat, and which means I have to go back and watch your videos just to actually create questions along the way. Yeah, so
Okay.
not right offhand anyway. So
There's nothing that I said which is really overly controversial. We're using sources.
right.
That
I will say this.
Except for my
Tell me as in your own words. I've heard through numerous sources, good, valid sources, people who actually have studied the works of Josephus and things like that. And I think you even mentioned it a few times. Would you say that the insert in the complete works of Josephus regarding this Jesus New Testament figure was authentic or fake?
I believe it's a fake. I believe
That's the same thing I hear from him, because it seems like that the language that is used in Josephus's work is that one spot is completely different.
Yeah,
And
there's
it's,
discussions of that. However, for truth value, as far as that concerned, for example, Bart Ehrman, for example, believes that the Josephus quote impartial is true, meaning that more than except something was said there to indicate there was somebody named Jesus who was killed by Pilate and
right.
maybe was messianic, but much more than that is not. You won't find too many scholars that, and even some decent Christian scholars will also say it just doesn't make sense. I mean, the historical information that we have is that basically before Eusebius, it's not there. And I quoted two sources where it should have been, because it was actually the topic there, and the author would have known it, and yet did not bring it. So if it's not brought there, then it's pretty certain it wasn't around.
Right. The thing that amazes me the most is this is a modern example. Modern meaning like not in Bible days or even in Rambam's days, but just like in the past 30 years, 50 years.
Right.
They've got a movie called Ben-Hur with I think Charleston Heston played in that too. Actually, I'm not sure, but he played in the Ten Commandments as well. But the thing that amazes me is, like, even in that movie, the Ben-Hur movie, they kind of saw this whole the whole movie was focused on this whole Ben-Hur thing. But then in the distant, they showed this scene or this thought process of this Jesus guy carrying a cross, and then they went back to their movie. And I'm thinking, if I was in that day and I was Ben-Hur or anybody in his sphere of influence, and I saw this guy who was dying, and the same guy performed all these miracles and raised the dead, I would say, the heck with this racing the chariots thing. I'm going to go follow this guy. Apparently, there was no big alerts, there was no big warning signs or big newscasts saying that there's this miracle worker like they do nowadays in these missionary circles. Say, "Holly, go to Pennsylvania."
What you have to mention another thing: miracle workers were a dime a dozen. I mean, in the Talmud talks about it. There's 2 or 3 of them living at the same time. So it wasn't it wasn't so unusual, such a thing like that. And I personally, again, as I said before, my personal feeling, because of my understanding about failed prophecy syndrome, how that works, and the fact that Jesus, my personal feeling is that there were a few factors involved, not just as it was a messianic person, because we're messianic people at the time also, and they didn't have movement, but he was also some kind of a itinerant preacher of some sort.
Right, I agree.
Preaching,
yeah.
Having a religious together with his political message together, and that, I mean, Pilate killed him for his political message.
Right.
The later church considered the religious message because of the friction with the Jews and stuff like that. But I think because of that religious message that he had with it, he wasn't just the regular type of messianic person. I mean, every messianic candidate at that time had a religious message, meaning that he was going to get rid of Rome and establish his kingdom here, whatever, et cetera, et cetera,
which would require getting rid of the current king, which is a threat to the political system. which is why
Oh well,
Jesus
well
died to begin
Josephus
with.
is quite
Right.
clear
Oh yeah.
that if you hang out your shingle and you say that you're Messiah, that's it. It's an automatic
Yeah,
death
it's a
sentence. Not even,
challenge. It's
yeah.
absolutely
You know,
a cockfight waiting to happen
yeah.
for sure.
Well, it's like they don't have. They never had due process. There's no such thing as due process there.
Okay.
You know, there were no constitutional rights. You didn't have a right of trial by jury. You didn't have a right to confront your witnesses. You didn't have all this thing. You went before the Roman,
Right.
and the Roman procurator had one job and one job only. That was make sure that two things occurred. Number one, the money flowed to Rome,
Right.
and if he stole extra money on the top of that, it's just a way of making money,
Right.
uh, which was
Now.
very common. And the second thing is that it had to be quiet,
Right.
no revolts.
Right.
So somebody called himself the Messiah after the experience they had. I mean, there were Messianic people who had minor revolts during the time, nothing really serious, until Bar Kokhba was the first Messianic person who there was a serious type of revolt. But when you have a situation like that going on, well, obviously you're going to have problems.
Right.
So,
Right. So the whole thing with Bar Kokhba and all these other things. I mean, there were handfuls, maybe more than handfuls, of messianic figures where people thought they might have been the guy. You know. So.
yeah, the New Testament mentions a couple. Josephus mentions others.
Right.
And it was a very, very turbulent time. And when there's turbulent times, people believe that the Messianic times are very close, because of course, if you read in the Tanakh, you find that Zechariah, Ezekiel, they talk about times where there's violence and things going on. So it's certainly something that people would think that would be happening. So there were Messianic people, and basically saying that the Messiah is given basically a death sentence. I mean, there is only one king,
Right.
and if Rome doesn't recognize it, that's it. It's not about it's treason. I mean, basically treason, and they don't.
Now a lot of
But that's
people.
one of the problems with the New Testament story, of course, is the way they talk about Pilate, and
Right. Right.
if Jesus had been arrested for stealing or something like that, where there was also a death penalty, you can understand Pilate maybe wanting to correspond to give in to crowds or something like that. But saying you're the Messiah is actually treason.
Right.
And your number one job there is to make sure such things don't happen. So it's not even possible that then. Besides the fact that, after all, you have all these supposed eyewitness reports of what happened in the trial.
It was like King. It was almost like.
There? Who was there? They didn't have a court reporter.
Right. It was like when King
David
in King David's time, right? So his son Absalom would meet people at the gates, like would try to intercept people to influence them to say, "Hey, I'm your guy. I'm the loving guy who's going to take care of you." To try to usurp the role of King Solomon. It's sort of the same thing, right? I mean, it was not the whole thing with Josephus. Wasn't he a traitor to begin with to the Jewish people? I mean, he
was originally part of the army. And then when he saw things were bad, he went to the Romans.
Right. To spare his own life. I mean, he actually
an interesting story.
Right. And that's what a lot of people don't understand. They don't understand that Josephus was a traitor. He wasn't a.
Well, no, Josephus makes clear. You have to understand, the war was not overly popular.
Right.
The war was brought about because of persecution of the religious religious things of the Jewish people at the time. And had there been there were a number of parties. The war broke out basically because Rome was trampling on religious rights in the temple and other areas like that. And basically, that's the only thing you can get to the Jewish people to fight then. Hanukkah, which is coming up soon, Hanukkah is all about that. The Greeks tried to basically stamp out the Jewish religion. And that led to a revolt. It didn't lead to there wasn't any political victory from that, actually. The political kingdom, whatever, didn't last very long, because two brothers from the Chashmonaim fought against each other, Stuart and Hyrcanus, and they asked the Romans to come in, so they almost immediately became a Roman client.
Right.
So it wasn't. Hanukkah was not about a military political victory. It was about a religious victory, because basically after that there was no power whatsoever by the Hellenists. Those people who were Hellenists, those who had some kind of support of the Romans and were not strict followers of the Jewish religion, these people were out. They had no anything at that time. Whereas at that time, when the Greeks were overlords, there was power in the the Greek party there, and they actually got control of the temple and had services there. So that's what caused the revolt. Revolts basically occurred when problems with religious things come. That's why, for example, Josephus brings, and we'll talk about this later, historical things. There was a revolt that came about in 6 CE when they tried to make a census in Israel, in Judea.
Right.
It didn't work because people revolted against it. It was an affront to the Jewish religious practice. And Josephus brings a whole bunch of interesting stories where the people would get angry. I mean, the Roman guards were really anti-Semitic. And they hated the Jewish religion. It was very part of it. They hated Jewish religion. So, I mean, there was a story where one Roman pulled down his pants by the temple and a whole riot broke out.
Kind of like the old story with Pentecost.
Yeah.
Right.
Caligula wanted them to put his statue in the temple.
Right.
And the people refused. And when the governor, the procurator, whatever the club was, I can't remember what it was at the moment, wanted to do it, everybody lied down and they were willing to die for it.
Right.
Whereas the procurator. So Josephus brings these stories. So, when the religious sensitivities were problems. So when it came to the revolt, there were a lot of people who did want to make peace. Josephus talks about it. The Talmud talks about it also. The rabbinical authorities wanted to make peace with Rome. They wanted to try and see what they could do in order to let the temple continue. But there was a group called the Baryonim, Zealots is what is in English. They couldn't care less.
Right,
so because of them, that's why the temple was destroyed.
Right.
Josephus talks about it, Talmud talks about it also. So
and if you think about this,
the political part was not important. The rabbis were only interested in the religious part of it.
So
because the revolt made its point.
So think of the Zealots, right? And so if Jesus himself in the New Testament, the character was a zealot himself, and he goes into the temple, which is an established set up thing with very strict rules and stuff, and he goes in there and starts turning tables over. I mean, what do you think's going to happen to this guy? There's nothing good can come of that.
There's a lot of weird things about some of the stories in there. First of all, I don't think any Christian knows what those tables were there for anyways.
Right.
There was nothing objectionable about it.
Right. It was normal.
Basically, the temples were very simple. If you came, people would come to the temple from all over the world.
Right.
And there were two things you had there. Number one, you had to give a half shekel. So if you came from a foreign land and your money was different, you had to change it to a shekel in order to fulfill your obligation. Josephus brings that from Babylonian exile, they sent cartloads of money in so people could pay their yearly dues.
Right.
And the second thing was, if you went to bring a sacrifice, I mean, most people don't know, we'll eventually get into discussion about sacrifices, but most sacrifices weren't about sin. Most sacrifices were in thanks of Hashem.
Right.
You'd buy an animal,
right.
You would sacrifice in the temple, some of it would be given to the priest, and the rest of it you take home and eat. Okay? But if you went to buy something there, again, you're coming with foreign currency. So you couldn't run all over the place, or sometimes you need to get a certain animal for a sacrifice. You couldn't run all over the city, so they had things, close to the temple to do it.
Right.
And that's what it was all about. So
it was an exchange.
The idea that you're doing
right.
that, somebody's doing something for some kind of pure motive that is stupid.
Right.
It sounds like, I'm not even sure that that's a true event.
Right. If it was a true event, it certainly would have caused for some tension, and it should not have been something that they should have let slide.
If it was a true event, he probably wouldn't have made it out alive.
Put it this way:
people would have beaten up.
To bring you to more current events, there was a guy, I think during Obama's time, where a guy somewhere near the White House ran and jumped a fence at the White House and took off running towards the White House, and they took him down. I mean,
that's right.
The guy wasn't innocent; he was totally guilty. What do you think? How could Jesus possibly be innocent when he did the same daggum thing in the temple, turning over tables and trying to disrupt?
There were guys that had to be in the temple,
right?
Make sure everything went in order, and he probably would have been beaten up at the time. He wouldn't have gotten away. He's
lucky he didn't get flogged sooner than he did.
There's reasons to doubt some of those stories. Maybe they didn't know exactly, but it's.
Right.
We're going to discuss a little bit about the historicity, some of the stories in the New Testament, whether we should believe it historically. We'll discuss some many different factors about the historicity of Jesus' issue. I'm just bringing right now,
Right.
one of the most important ones is actually what we know from outside the New
Right.
Testament.
Okay. Let me shift on because I want to get a couple questions in here. Okay, Deanna, do me a favor. Open up the question. Deanna, open up the question from Pablo. I want to see that again because I can't see it now. But we're gonna move. We're gonna go back to Pablo's question in a minute. Mr. I never can get that right. Mr. Enape on YouTube says, "Why is calling yourself Messiah? If Jesus, if okay, this is for you, Rabbi. If Jesus really thought he was Messiah, keep that in the context. Why is calling yourself Messiah illegal or blasphemous? Wasn't a Messiah merely something or someone who was
Okay,
anointed?"
got it. Okay, go ahead. Okay, first of all,
Okay.
for the Jewish people, somebody called themselves Messiah even today, basically, he'd be considered a mental case unless he was somebody of such a character that people thought he could be.
Okay.
Otherwise, I mean, there's a whole thing in Israel that's called the Messiah complex. People go to Israel and all of a sudden they think of the Messiah, and it's a mental illness. Okay,
Oh,
but
great.
let's assume for the sake that Jesus was a very pious person, religious, and he actually thought he could have been the Messiah. Religiously, there's nothing wrong with it. Okay, however, for Rome, calling yourself Messiah means that you are saying that you are the king of the Jewish people and eventually, of course, of the whole world. Now, I do not think the Roman emperor would appreciate that very much.
Right.
And that's basically what we're talking about. I mean, he wouldn't say, the guy's a nutcase. He'd say, get rid of him. And remember, Pilate and every other person who had his position, procurator, one of his jobs was to see that peace is maintained in the land. If somebody says the Messiah, it means that people are going to agitate for something. And that being the case, it is something that is of interest and something that they would want to see suppressed. It's really basically as simple as that. Whether the authorities, it depends. I mean, there were, in fact, people who were close to the Greeks still. The Sadducee party, for example. The Pharisees were not. The Pharisees and the people were very close together. Sadducees and something like that. Some of them were in the priesthood there. So there's a possibility that they might have been working there. There were always lackeys for the Roman government, obviously. But, for the normal people wouldn't really care. It wasn't very much. I mean, he doesn't appear to have been a very important person. If we agree that he's not even mentioned in Josephus, he's basically a non-entity.
Right. Okay, cool. So let's see. Okay, the other question was, let me find it here. When the Jews, this could be taken negatively or positively. That's why I want to. If it's within question, I want to actually cover it. Okay, so when the Jews, now keep in mind that the whole New Testament explanation of anything Jewish is usually spun negatively, like the synagogue of Satan.
Well, we saw from the Ethiopian version of Josephus that it goes from time to time until it's like, the Ethiopian church, by the way, sainted Pontius Pilate, so you can see where things are going.
Right. Okay, so what I want to read is and Deanna did the right thing by actually blocking this cat because he seemed like he's a troublemaker, but this is a good topic to highlight on. So this is a New Testament believer only, someone who probably really despises Judaism, I'm guessing, which is why Deanna blocked this cat. But I wanted the question to be addressed by you because you can give these other on-seeing Christians the right perspective on why his question is wrong. Here's the question. When the Jews plotted to kill Jesus, when or how did they decide it was okay to break the fifth commandment? Carry on.
Well, I'm not quite sure what that question is. First of all, the Jews didn't conspire. Even according to the New Testament, would have only been basically the Jewish lackeys to Rome, we should call them, because that's not the Jews. The Jewish people hated Rome in general, but there were some lackeys to Rome. That's pretty known. So if there was any Jewish involvement, that's who we're talking with. Number two, I'm not quite sure what how the fifth commandment goes into that. They didn't kill him. The Romans did. I mean, if they killed him themselves, they would be violating the commandment.
Right.
If the Romans is a different story. And finally, let's try and put it in the best light for these people.
Okay.
Okay.
Very good.
Let's put it into the best light, because personally, I don't think that it's true. I think that these are all part of, an attempt to blame the Jewish people
Right.
for basically a Roman issue. Um, let's put it in the best light. Let's say it's like this. These guys saw that Jesus called himself Messiah. They knew from experience that Rome would clamp down and there'd be considerable amount of persecution. Many, many people would get killed. And anybody who knows what happened during the wars, when there were Kabbalah war, we're not talking about, a few hundred people. We're talking about thousands. Bar Kokhba, there's hundreds of thousands believed to be killed. By the war in 70, I think also the figure was that amount, with huge amounts of people being sold into slavery. We're not talking about any kind of minor issue here going on, okay? So the idea might have been, especially among people who were lackeys of Rome, that, hey, this is going to hurt us considerably. Let us turn him over. And under this condition, they would say that, well, this person is a danger to Jewish lives, or a danger to lives, and as such, he's considered as somebody who's trying to kill people. He himself is, in fact, doing something that's going to cause the death of many people, and so it's justified to take somebody out. Put it in the same way. I mean, I don't like using this, but any kind of example to Hitler is bad. But, let's put it this way. If you would believe that because of that there would be a Roman invasion, which would lead to hundreds of thousands of people being killed, then you would be in the same position of, say, knowing Hitler and knowing that if he followed his ways, that millions of people would be killed, and you would feel justified in having killed him. That would be the best way. But I don't believe any of this stuff. I think it's a bunch of baloney. But, if you want to look at it from that point of view, I mean, if anything ever happened, if there any kind of Jewish involvement by these people who were lackeys of Rome, it was probably because of they were concerned that there would be disturbances which would lead to the loss of thousands and thousands of lives.
Okay, right.
Okay, that's I mean, again, it's not the case. First of all, I don't think it's true at all. Second of all, I don't think it has to do with the Fifth Commandment, at all, whatever. I don't think that this case is, as it says there wasn't a trial from a Sanhedrin like that, the official Sanhedrin court, whatever, going, maybe they took him in the back room or whatever, if anything happened. There's too many stories. We're going to talk about some of the problems with the actual story itself as to why we don't think it's so true. And that much of it was made up. And especially, remember, if you look at what we just saw today, we see that what I refer to as an arc. You can see stories have an arc where they get built onto.
Right.
And you can see the end, you can see earlier, and you can try and just take it all the way back to see what might have been at the beginning. You have it at a certain town. You see an arc of what's going on, you can take it back.
Right.
You see the New Testament, the involvement of the Jews goes farther and farther. John's more 2nd century, we have Barnabas, and by the end, the Ethiopians make Pilate a saint. Whereas most likely what happened in the beginning is certainly Pilate was responsible for it. Whether there was any Jewish involvement in that, I don't really know.
Right, gotcha.
Jewish involvement could have just been added. There's no way of knowing that.
Okay, wow. Well, we had a great night tonight. Longest show in the history of our gathering on your shows,
right.
countering the missionary claims, for sure. So it was good. In fact, if there were more questions, I'd probably keep on going because I'm feeling a little energetic, even though I've been sick tonight. So, point being, thank you so much for your time here and your mission to help us fight this missionary battle. It's constantly a threat for sure. I don't know so much about a threat, but it's definitely something that needs to be addressed. To be a threat, I think it has to be something that is convincing so many people, but it's really not. It's not very convincing at all. But the whole idea of counter missionary which is why I actually, after 20 plus years, I've left Christianity myself. I don't know if you do this, but my biological father, grandfather, uncles, they were all preachers, pastors, teachers, and I was one of them myself, and I eventually came out. So thanks to learning enough Hebrew to save my skin, made it out of the hot fire, if you want to call it that. So anyway, thank you again once for everybody here for tuning in and for supporting the channel. It's been a really interesting journey for sure, and I really look forward to spending more time with you guys. So thank you, Rabbi. Love you, man, and we'll see you next week. Hashem willing, same time, same place. If something happens schedule-wise, we will make sure to let you know, at least the day of, or sooner if we can. Take care, everybody. Shalom, shalom.
תמיד כולם ביחד, חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה והכמיהה. אני אתה אתם תמיד כולם ביחד, חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה,